Hello there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. And today I'm joined by a wonderful dear friend of mine, the wonderful Cait Donovan. Cait is a keynote speaker, host of Fried, the Burnout podcast, an incredible podcast you got to get to listen to. If you are burning out, that is a wonderful podcast to listen to. And if you're not burning out, well, you could do at some point. So listen to the podcast. And if you've never burnt out and you don't intend to burn out and you don't think you'll be burning out, I would still recommend listening to the podcast. It's absolutely wonderful. She's author of the book, The Bounce Back Ability Factor. She's also an acupuncturist with a master's degree in Chinese medicine. Her creative burnout recovery solutions have been featured on podcasts and online magazines, such as, get this, Forbes, NPR, and the New York Post, and in companies such as Lululemon and PepsiCo. So, Cait, after that introduction, it is so great to have you on the podcast. Been looking forward to this a while. We're both obviously friends and members of, we're served on the board of the National Speakers Association, New York City chapter. Great to actually talk to you on a podcast for once. Thanks a million for doing this.
I'm so excited to be here. I've been waiting for it. I'm waiting for the banter. I'm waiting for the good stuff. And I'm also, you can right away criticize the name of my book. It was a bad choice. I thought it was clever. No one can say it. We'll just move on.
You know what? I mean, if you just, the name I think is great. If you just change the bounceability piece and then the factor piece and then if you just change those three words, the title works. But I mean,
That's
I
what I
like
thought.
the term bounce back ability. Obviously, like you pointed out, it's hard to say, but I like it just because it, I suppose, emphasizes like what word I use for the same kind of concept as anti-fragile. So I use the term anti-fragile, even though it wasn't exactly meant that way when Taleb talked about it in terms of his book Anti-Fragile, but I still really love using that as something extra on resilience. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this, but there's resilience, bouncing back, and then there's bouncing back better, and there's being anti-fragile, and there's post-traumatic growth and all those different things. Anyway, we'll tackle all that. You are an expert in the area of burnout. So you are better at burning out than anyone else has ever been burnt out. You can help people burn out.
Hashtag number one.
Hashtag number one. Is it a case that if I'm like, I come to you, you're like, okay, you're not doing enough, so here's another 15 tasks, and then you might get a chance of burning out? Is that what you do? Or now, if you could share with us what you do and what got you to this, if you can give us a little bit of a brief exploration as to how you got to what you're doing today and what you do today.
You know, what I like to do most is totally overwhelm people.
Yeah.
That's the best way to go about it.
Good.
But really, I always felt really lucky that I was able to follow my heart in my life. I left a med school journey to go to study Chinese medicine instead. Like, I originally started on a pre-med path as a biology major. I threw everything away, moved from Boston to California, did this totally hippie studies, got a master's in Chinese medicine, loved it, thought it was great. Went to Argentina, met my future husband, moved to Europe, lived this life, created an acupuncture office in a foreign country in a foreign language. I think that on paper, I'm doing everything that I possibly can to live as close as I possibly can to my values, to my desires, to my heart, to my passion, to all those things. And maintaining some sense of humility, but I'm incredibly successful at it. I have a 3-month waiting list for my acupuncture office. I am 27 years old. I'm on national Polish TV. I'm on talk shows. I'm teaching all over the country. I'm like killing it. And miserable. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. At some point, I told my husband, I got to get out of this country. The problem is the country. You know, that was my thing. So we moved to Prague. He got a different job. We moved to Prague.
Which country was it?
We were in Poland at the time.
Oh, yeah. Well, that makes sense. No, I'm joking. I'm kidding.
Yeah, it does.
All the Polish people.
I mean, honestly, I love Poland for so many reasons, and it's not a great place for me.
Okay.
So we moved to Prague. Prague is a lot softer. People don't care as much about what you look like, what you're doing, who you're making out with on the street. It doesn't, Prague is sort of just like free for all. And I started another acupuncture business and built up again from scratch. And I had wonderful patients. I was working 25 hours a week. So I rebuilt in a different way and it was working, except for I was still exhausted and I couldn't figure out what was going on. I read an article one day of just the same as you. I do nothing but read when I'm not podcasting or speaking. So I was reading and I found this article and it went through like a checklist of burnout signs and symptoms. And I just saw myself like my eyes, even it wasn't my hand ticking up. My eyes were just going tick, tick, tick all the way down the list. And when I got to the bottom, I thought to myself, when you finish an acupuncture degree, it's basically 4 years of learning how stress affects the body. Of course, the words that we're using are different. We're talking about spleen chi and liver chi, but the concepts are how do external and internal stressors affect your basic health and how do you bring yourself back to balance? That's it. So I'm thinking to myself, how could I, of all people, have ended up in a place where stress overran me? I wasn't able to keep up. I had been meditating since I was 18, doing yoga. I learned breathing exercises when I was 10. What? How did this happen to me? So I did what I do. And I downloaded every bit of research that had been done on burnout up until 2016. My husband was doing a postgrad at Cambridge at the time, so I had access to university libraries. I just downloaded everything. It took me a year to read through it all. And as I read through it, what I noticed was it was about corporate workers and doctors and nurses. So hospital workers and corporate workers. And I was like, but I'm an entrepreneur. So these things don't always fit me. So what the heck is going on with me? That made my journey deepen. More books, therapy, coach, functional nutritionist, and acupuncture. I needed all of those things to get out of it. And when I started coming through, I started writing about it online. And people started asking me questions like, oh, I've been feeling like that too. What did you do next? Oh, and then as this stuff does, it unfolded into this journey that I could have never planned.
So, with regards to where you are on this journey, what do you pretty much do now, Kate? Who are you working with and what are you helping them to do primarily?
So within associations and big corporations, I'm doing keynotes just to raise awareness on burnout, give people the language that they need to talk about it, help people understand that burnout isn't necessarily anybody's fault, that pointing fingers and finding blame is not really helpful. But how can we talk about it and how can we look at it as a holistic system to understand why it might have shown up? One-on-one, my perfect clients are people that are in the depths, like I call this stuck in the muck, who are just in the depths of burnout, can't see perspective, have no idea what possibilities exist before them, and they really don't think that it's possible to get out of this place. That's my favorite client. I like to take them from there to this place where they have a clear path. They might not be done with burnout when we're done with coaching, but they know where they're going, they know what they need, and they're on a clear journey. And outside of those two things, I'm creating the podcast, which is my fave.
Fantastic. So, look, a few things I want to dive into with you, Kate, with regards to burnout. First of all, as you know, as we've talked, neuroscience is a big interest to me. It's something that I've spent a lot of time on. And I also know that's also an area that you've, especially recently, have been doing a lot of work on in terms of the approach that you take. When it comes to the neuroscience, obviously we have the usual elements of what happens with chronic stress. So you got the HPA axis being dysregulated, you've got too much cortisol, you've got the impact that has on serotonin, dopamine, all that sort of stuff. With regards to the impact it has on the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus shrinking, like there's all of these things that we know, or at least is postulated in the research of what stress does on a long-term basis. And then we have what it does in terms of the impact it has on the physical body and how it promotes inflammation and how it decreases the activity of the immune system. It's like there's all of these different things. From your perspective or your point of view, when you explain to a client or you explain to an organization about the neuroscience, what are the highlights that you could get across to them? What is most important in your experience for them to know about stress? And then I'm going to have a follow-up question, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
So I think you already said it. First, the prefrontal cortex piece. So the prefrontal cortex shrinks with chronic stress. When you're in burnout, you have lost already a significant portion. And when we say lost a significant portion, we're talking 0.5 millimeter. That is a significant portion. You're not losing inches of your brain, but you are losing enough cells to make an actual difference in the amount of brain volume that can be measured on an MRI or a functional MRI. So the loss of prefrontal cortex function that goes along with the volume is something that I share with people because I think that it allows the person experiencing burnout and the people around them to understand why they can't do things the way they used to do. So that part of your brain, as you already know, is responsible for planning, task initiation, focus, emotional regulation, connection, empathy, etc. Pulling out short-term memory, we could go on and on, right? There's however many functions that are attached to this part of the brain. If that is not working properly, you can't expect people to be able to function the right way. I just feel like if we just understood that that was offline, is how I usually describe it. Like that part of their brain is offline. So you're asking them to task initiate and they literally can't. It's not that dissimilar to ADHD. And there's a lot of overlap between people that have ADHD and burnout. This is a really common thing that happens together. And then at the same time, the anterior cingulate cortex, it has many functions, but one of the things that it does is helps the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex to talk to one another, right? Because the brain is a series of connections. There's a million things happening at once. There's never just one part that's responsible for one thing. But the amygdala is, am I safe? Am I not safe? Is there a threat that I need to react to or not, right? The amygdala grows with chronic stress. So you have this amygdala that's on fire, that's hypervigilant, that's seeing danger everywhere. And the front part of your brain can't tell it to calm down. So yesterday I was walking in the forest and I saw underneath me what looked like a snake coming out of the ground. When that happens, your amygdala goes, oh my God, snake. But my prefrontal cortex looked down and said, oh, that's actually just a stick coming out of the ground. And
Yeah.
it just happens to have the shape of a snake head at the top. And so I didn't have any reaction to it. But when your brain can't communicate that way, your emotions get wild. One of the most common complaints I hear from people is I'm treating people poorly, colleagues, family, partners, and I can't seem to stop myself. And I know that it's happening. Like I see it happen and I'm disappointed and embarrassed and I still can't stop myself. So I think understanding that people can't function as well and that their emotions are really hard to manage creates a space where we can give ourselves and give other people a little bit more grace than we're accustomed to.
I really love that explanation. And I think it's a very relatable and very immediately applicable way of understanding how this is actually manifesting and impacting on the work. I want to get into the cynical or sort of that part or that piece in terms of symptomatically of stress in a bit and of
Yeah.
burnout in a bit. Before we do, I would love to get your perspective on something. So there's a lot of research, which again, I know you're familiar with, done by different professors, such as Professor Alia Crum, in work on mindset. And we have obviously the stress is, what is it? The stress is a good thing, stress is a benefit, stress is enhancing mindset. Sorry. So there's the stress is enhancing mindset, the whole notion from the research that says that, look, stress itself is bad for you unless you believe that it's good for you, in which case it's not nearly as bad for you. And so the way I understand it, then I'd love to hear you explain from your point of view, because on the one hand, for years in acupuncture, Chinese medicine, you've been studying how stress messes with your body. On the other hand, in the Western world, I know you're also you've studied that and you've been neck deep in understanding the neuroscience and the biology from a Western perspective, again on stress. And so if there's one thing we can guarantee, it's stress is bad for you for all the reasons we just outlined. At the same time, we have the mindset piece that if you change the way in which you interpret it, the way I like to think through this is through Lisa Feldman Barrett, the neuroscientist who talks about the way we make predictions. And so the three sources of information we get is from the world, from our bodies, and from our brain. And so if you shift your mindset, the mind is really where we have memories and concepts. And by shifting our mindset, we change the concept. So that in turn affects the way in which we organize what's going on for our body and regulate our body budget and so forth. That's how I like to think about it, just because it makes it sort of easier for me to explain, because it's kind of paradoxical. Stress is bad for you, except if you believe that it's not bad for you, then it's a lot less bad for you and sometimes isn't even bad for you. Could you just explain from your perspective, again, when you break, because I'm sure mindset is a part of the work that you do with the
Yeah.
clients that you work with, how do you help people understand that, especially when it's a little bit, well, it's black and it's white and it's yellow and it's green and it's none of those colors? Like, how do you communicate that?
Yeah. It's absolutely gray. It's 100% gray. There are, and you know this, right? There's eustress and there's distress. So there's already two categories of stress, one of them saying that this is good and beneficial and helps you to grow. People talk about eustress in a way of like, if you want to grow your biceps, you have to do bicep curls and you will create tears in your muscles. And that is stress. But those tears will heal if you don't overwork it and your biceps will grow. Pretty simple idea of how stress can be beneficial, help you grow. And there's distress, which is more disarming, more difficult to process, etc. When I think about this, I love Aaliyah Crum and Kelly
McGonigal.
Yeah, right. Right. Both incredible researchers that have done so much to open our eyes to how stress can be beneficial in our worlds. And what I've found in my most recent research is that people that have high levels of adverse childhood experiences, which can count as a various number of traumas, neglect, abuse, etc., they have developmental delays in their brains. And so when it comes to mindset, I find that people that burn out, I see a strong correlation between people that have high levels of adverse childhood experiences and people that burn out. And I think that being able to shift your mindset requires a certain level of connectivity and use in your brain that some of us don't have as much of. That's number one. Number two, there are studies that show that if, say, a mother, this is especially true for mothers to daughters, if a mother has an extreme stress event during her pregnancy, the child that is born can have an epigenetic shift to the gene that is responsible for activating or deactivating the stress response. So epigenetics, right, for those of you who are not aware, when epigenetics is this idea that the environment and your life and your experiences can put a volume button on your DNA and make a gene stronger or make a gene weaker. And you might not know that it's happening. So with people that have this epigenetic shift on their stress response system, they might not be able to appropriately respond to stress, which means their cortisol is never getting high enough to reach its feedback loop to turn itself down. Right. So cortisol builds up in the body. It goes up to a point where the brain says, okay, we have enough cortisol. And then the stress response starts to calm down. But if you said something earlier about there being stress and high cortisol, that's not necessarily true. A lot of times with burnout, people's cortisol levels are not high enough. So they're never getting all the way through the stress cycle because their cortisol doesn't go high enough to shut it down. Does that make sense? So I think that when we're talking about the mindset piece, we have to keep in mind that there are people whose levels of self-blame and judgment and shame because of things that they grew up with are so high that that mindset shift can be a little bit out of reach for them. Do I think it's possible to get to a place where you can use the mindset shift? Yes. If I didn't, I wouldn't do this work because that would be silly. The brain is plastic. It can change. Lots of things can change. But I do believe that some of us have a bit of a detriment, and mindset is almost the last of the things that I'll work on with people because their brains are not primed to be able to do it when we meet.
You know what that reminds me of, Cait, is
What?
I remember the notion of the level of the locus of control with regards to
Yes.
stress, and how the more control you
Yes.
have over a situation, the less stressed typically you are. And I remember listening to
Yeah.
an interview with Robert Sapolsky, the wonderful
Mm-mm.
researcher who was the author of the book Why
Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Ulcers and Behave, another
Mm-hmm.
classic. One of the things he mentioned is he goes, look, while that's true and useful in lots of different areas, if you're in a situation where you don't have the physical resources, for example, that's well and good for you if you're middle class, if you're earning enough money, if you're in this position. But if you're struggling
Yes.
and if you're trying to make ends meet and you don't have the resources, then it doesn't matter how much control you perceive yourself as having or not. If you don't have the resources, you don't have the resources. And sometimes the challenge is, on the one hand, you want to empower people to feel like they're heroes, because if you do, they've more of a chance to take the action they need. But on the flip side,
Yeah.
telling someone who can't do anything, oh, you could just need to focus on what you can do, is problematic, because then while trying to make them a hero, you're actually victimizing even more. So that's kind of, if I'm,
Yes,
again, I know it's a different example, but it kind of fits the same way. It's like,
it
on the
does.
one hand, yes, mindset shift, yes, try to get it, yes. However, it's not as easy for everyone to be able to make that
Yes.
shift. So don't be expecting the same things. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you are right on track with this. I think that we just have to understand that not everybody is starting out with a full battery.
Yeah, I love it. And I love the explanation. With regards to the symptoms or so, I know that one of the things I've heard you say before is that there's three core elements. And I think this comes from not Maslow, but
Maslach.
Maslach. Yeah,
Yeah.
Christina Maslach. And she talks about things. I want to ask you what those three are and share. And I might interrupt you
Yeah.
because there's one of them I want to ask you a question about. So if you could share with us what the core three things are, the symptoms that let you know whether or not you're burned out or whatnot.
Yeah, the core three things, all three of them have to be present for somebody to say that is burnout. And I think that's important to say. It's not one, not two, all three have to be present. The first one is physical and emotional exhaustion, which sort of makes me laugh because that covers almost like 60% of any symptoms that you could ever have,
Yeah. Yeah.
ever. It's fatigue, it's inability to exercise, it's slow digestion, it's inability to manage your emotions. It's like we could go on with all of the symptoms that are related to just that very broad umbrella that they give us as step number one. Step number two, which is where you want to talk, is cynicism and detachment.
So a quick question on that one is, can you be born with that? Like, can you be born
I
cynical?
think you know the answer to that question.
Yeah, yeah. Because I was saying, like, I'm like chronically burnt out. If it was just one of the three, I'd be chronically burnt out because, the cynicism piece. But with that, just to explore on that, with cynicism, how would a person know the difference between the fact that they've got negative, for example, from my area belief, they've got a negative worldview about people. Maybe it's emotional belief, so it happens when they're in certain moods. Usually it primes, or they're in a certain way of thinking
Mm-hmm.
about people, or it's part of their personality. They're just grumpy all the time versus burnout? Is it because of the presence of the other two, or is there any other specific way of thinking about this symptom as different when you're burnt out versus something else?
My personal experience with it, and something that I've seen in hundreds of people since then, is that it doesn't change. You don't have spurts of joy when you're burnt out. You don't have the moments that are clearer. It's just awful. End of story. And so then the question comes up, like, how does this differ then from depression? And the truth is that in the research, they're not 100% clear yet. They're still looking for these delineating markers, which is why the definition of burnout still says as part of your occupation. Right? This is job related, which is nonsense. It's not just job related, but that is included in the definition, that these three things have to be included, and it has to be related to how you're feeling at your job. That's just not true, but we don't have a lot of good other ways. I personally was not depressed when I was burnt out. I have been depressed when I have been burnt out, and they were very different experiences. But I do think that burnout takes advantage of and exploits the places where your body and mind, your physical health, your mental health are already weak. So if you have a tendency toward depression, when you're burnt out, you're going to feel depressed. If you have a tendency toward anxiety, when you're burnt out, you're going to feel anxious. If you had whiplash when you were 12, when you're burnt out, you're probably going to have neck pain and headaches. If you went to Mexico and drank too much water from the tap and got diarrhea when you were 6, then you might have GI issues when you're burnt out. Right? It's going to go for whatever's weakest. And so if you already have a negative view, it's going to get worse, and you're going to lose your capability to have the positive moments. You're not even going to have the moments.
So, with that in mind, and I know there's a third one, when I've heard you
Yeah.
say the third one versus I've heard it described elsewhere, the way they describe it
Yeah.
elsewhere is more work oriented in terms of the
Yeah.
function of the job. Could you share
Yeah.
with everyone that third piece? Because I find it interesting that just like you were saying there, you also present it in a way that is less work focused.
Yeah. So when it's work focused, it's called lack of productivity, flat out. And there's other pieces of research that point to this idea of lack of impact, of understanding, of not being able to understand that what you do in the world is worthwhile at all, feeling like what you do is useless. And this doesn't matter if you are a neurosurgeon or if you sweep the streets. You just don't think what you do is worthwhile. When I was burning out, I was helping people have babies with acupuncture. Like, I don't know if there's anything bigger that you can help people do in their lives. People that are struggling to conceive are really suffering. And I was helping and I didn't care. It's terrible to say, but I was to the point where when somebody got pregnant, I was like, oh, thank God, at least now they'll come off my list. I wasn't thinking about the fact that I was helping them to create the family that they've been wanting for 6 or 8 years. So you lose the understanding of the why of the value. And that's really dangerous.
What are some things that organizations can do to reduce burnout?
If you look at the list of things that Maslach and her team have said over the years is responsible for burnout, you have to manage people's workloads, which is not often done. That's really simple. DE&I and B initiatives are important because lack of fairness can add to a burnout situation. If you are somehow othered in your workplace and you're getting paid less and you're doing more work, that's going to lead to burnout, or at least be a factor in burnout. Increasing levels of recognition is critical, and recognition in this way, right? Recognition lights up the reward pathways in the brain. So getting recognition is actually really critical to your overall morale. But it can't be like an atta girl. It's got to be, hey, you wrote that email last week to that one customer that was really disgruntled and you were able to smooth it over. And I'm really grateful. Thank you for managing that so well.
It,
That kind of feedback needs to be happening.
One of the things I talk about quite a lot is the specificity of feedback is the critical. If you look at the brain and how it reacts to feedback, the neuroplasticity is
Yeah.
triggered much more, not by necessarily negative or positive, but by specificity. So when it's
Yeah.
specific, you're much more likely to answer it. And it sounds it's the same there. With regards to, and that's some
Yeah.
great techniques there, Cait. I want to talk to you about the value of resentment, which I love. I'd love your take on that because I know I've heard you say that. And again, that's one of those ideas that people go, what do you mean value of resentment? Like, I'm very resentful of everyone. So if you can help me to use my anger and resentment and hatred in a positive way, that would be wonderful. So how can I use my resentment for humankind more productively? No, seriously, I know you talk about the value of
Yeah.
resentment. So I'd love you to explore that a bit for me.
Resentment is my favorite emotion, hands down. And one of the reasons why is because when I was burnt out, there was a lot of advice out there telling me to like be grateful and do gratitude journals, and says write 3 specific things. Again, we're back to specificity because the brain loves specificity, right? Write 3 specific things that you're grateful for at the end of your day. It can be small, like how the mug felt in your hand, or it can be big. You can't just write like family, house, and job every day. It's got to be a little better than that. And I tried. And that just, it didn't do anything for me because I wasn't in a place where I could actually feel those emotions. When you have a moment of awe or gratitude, that it spreads through your body immediately. There's a physical sensation attached to it. For me personally, it's expansion. I couldn't feel it. Gratitude does not help you if you don't feel it. And gratitude is really hard to study because it's impossible to have a control, right? Like either you're feeling gratitude or you're not. Like which group you're in. So that's a really hard thing to study. But it is, when you have feelings of gratitude, they're so useful. But if you can't access them, then you've got to go to what you can access and use that as the tool, because that makes your job easier. And when you're burnt out, you need things to be as easy as possible. Now, resentment in particular will teach you every single place in your life where your boundaries are being crossed, or you are overstepping your own boundaries in an act of people pleasing for fear of not being valuable or loved. So
With that, resentment as a superpower is your ability to
Mm,
know where you're overdoing it, where you're lacking the sufficient boundaries to keep your sanity or keep your emotional health at
yeah.
bay. So, with that in mind, how do you know the difference between when you're resentful or when you're, for example, jealous? Like, let's say, for example, I'm resentful of something. How do I know the difference between the fact that I feel bad about that because my boundaries are being violated, or I feel bad about the fact that I'm not where I need to be? Like, it's you're taking too much of me, therefore I resent you, versus I want a different life or I want to achieve this particular outcome, and you're stopping me from doing that. And I know one answer is, well, which is it? You just fucking ask the question. But is there any other way that you know that this is resentment from a boundaries point of view versus another form of resentment?
Well, I think that's still a boundaries point of view. So if you are jealous of someone, then you are likely resenting their life because there are things that they are allowing themselves to have and do that you are not allowing yourself to have and do. So oftentimes people will be resentful of other people leaving work at 5 o'clock and they're like, well, I stay until 6. Well, then don't stay until 6.
What about when they
That's the solution.
What about when they insult, like, for example, they disrespect you and you resent the fact that they always
Yes.
disrespect you? Again, that's kind of boundaries as well. Does that still plug in from your way of thinking into
Yeah.
burnout?
Yes. Absolutely. So when we go through resentment, we go through a series of questions, right? I have people do a resentment journal and they start writing things down and we look for patterns. What things are bothering you most commonly? What person is popping up in your inbox who's making you roll your eyes every time you see their name? What is happening with let's look and find the pattern so that we can work on one whole chunk of things all together instead of a singular event. And then we go through a question sieve, is what I call it. The first question is, if this is a thing that needs to be done, if this is an action, does this thing even need to be done at all? Does the thing you're feeling resentment about doing or not, does it need to be done? If it doesn't need to be done, you can let it go. This is pruning. You're taking something off your plate. You're buying yourself back some energy. Fabulous. If it does need to be done, are you the person that needs to do it? Really, really think about it. Do you need to do it? Or could it be delegated to a person or a software? Because both are decent options. If it needs to be done and you need to do it, is there a tool that would make it easier or lighter? Can you upgrade your tools? Can you get better software? Can you afford to? I was getting mad that my eggs were stuck to the pan in the morning, and I was like mad about it every single day. Get a new pan. Upgrade the tool. Make it easier on yourself. If none of those things apply, we're looking at a boundary situation. Then the question becomes, am I giving people more than they're asking for? And then expecting more gratitude than I'm getting? Or am I being exploited? If I'm being exploited, then you have to have a boundary conversation, right? You have to have an external conversation with somebody that says, if you continue to do this, I will X. Because something that people often confuse is the difference between a request and a boundary. You can make a request for a behavior change of someone. That's not a boundary. A boundary is what you will do if they don't honor your request, how you will react to it. So no one can really break your boundaries except for you, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's a great answer. Let me ask you, when you had those things that you were resenting around breakfast, was that excruciating for you?
It really,
Sorry, that
really,
was just
truly was.
sorry, that was a yoke. I was just yoking with you. I'll stop. I'll stop. I won't do any more for anyone that's cringing and dying. A few more questions before we go into the
Yeah.
lightning round, if that's okay, Kate. The BRAT
Yeah.
framework is something: beliefs, resources, abilities, trust, that you use
Mm,
and you work with people. Could you
yeah.
just talk us through when you use that and how you use that and what the purpose of it is?
So the BRAT framework is for when you have to have those boundary external conversations, when you've realized that you're being exploited in some way, somebody is stepping into your garden, somebody's taking too much. The BRAT framework is beliefs, resources, abilities, and trust. Using at least one of those words in a conversation with someone when you're stating a boundary is more likely to be met with compassion and grace than using any other combination of words. Because what you're doing is giving the power back to the other person to change the scenario. Instead of saying, I don't like what you're doing, don't do that to me anymore, bugger off. You're saying, exactly, with the head shake.
I love you.
You're
Your voice
saying,
started sounding, more Jersey there. It's like, I don't know what
yeah,
you're talking about here. So yeah, that was great.
exactly. If it sounds more Fall River, to be specific, it sounds more Massachusetts. But if you're in that scenario, and you say you have the same person that started at your office and they're constantly asking you for the number on the spreadsheet that they also have access to. And you're like, why am I still giving you this number? Like, stop asking me for this. And you're getting really annoyed. Instead of being like, stop asking me for this, you say, hey, here's the shared resource we have. I believe in your ability to find the things you need on this sheet. I trust that you'll find what you need. And then end the conversation. You're giving the person the power to say, here, you might need to share the resource with them again, and you might need to repeat this a couple of times. But all you're saying is, I believe in your ability to do this without me. You have the resources, you have abilities. I trust you, I believe in you. So using some combination of these words, at least one of these words, will help you to formulate a boundary that feels kinder to you, which leads to less feelings of guilt, which means you're more likely to implement it.
It's great, really good. And I particularly like the approach to using or leveraging these words when you're in that response. I've got two more questions for you, Cait, if that's okay. Is that okay? Am I crossing any boundaries?
Sure. I'll take it this time.
Okay, thank you. With regards to boundaries, one of the things that has frustrated me in the last few years that I want your take on, and it's not so much with boundaries when it comes to burnout per se, or at least the traditional understanding of, hey, Cait, can you do
Mhm,
this for me? Can you do that for me? It's
mhm.
more a case of this notion of that is more American, I think, that I've seen in America, at least more than
Yeah.
others, but it's this glorification of boundaries as this now all of a sudden I can use boundaries as an excuse to be to not make
Rude.
an effort for people. I mean, at the end of the day, treating
Yeah.
people well, sometimes you make sacrifices for your friends, sometimes you
Yeah.
go out of your own way to help people. And we've all done it. You've done it, I've done it. We do it for our
Yeah.
family, they do it for us. We do it for friends, they do it for us. You don't want to go to that birthday party, but you go. Why? Because you're doing it for somebody else.
Yeah.
And over the last few years, I've just noticed a lot of people are like, no, my boundary is I'm not going to do this because I need to protect myself. And that's fine if you're really in the position. But I think also it's almost like I see sometimes boundaries as being used by people as an opportunity to be selfish. Can you
Mhm.
comment on what your thoughts are around what I've said? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you feel about it?
I absolutely agree, and I often tell my podcast listeners that we're not building electric fences. Our boundaries are not electric fences. Our boundaries are fences, and they have plenty of gates. And part of boundaries, when you look at boundary research, we're always looking at a continuum from integration to segmentation. And different parts of your life will be at different places on this continuum. And the integration piece, I think, is where people have more trouble with boundaries than the segmentation piece. Right now, we're in this harsh segmentation where we're just like cutting everything away. But the people that cut everything away often also have a really hard time asking for help. So they put up the electric fence, but it works against them too. So you have to figure out in which areas of your life you need more integration. You need more people in your world. You need more people to feel safer. You need to accept help and support. And where do you need to put up protections because you're dealing with a bully or a narcissist or something else? Most of the time, the answer is somewhere in the middle. And my personal rule for setting boundaries and saying no to things is if this thing is going to overly interfere with my feelings of generosity, then I'm going to say no. And that's that. If it's going to interfere with my ability to feel generous, I'm going to say no. I also say no to things if I'm feeling a little bit of martyrdom around them. Like, I'll do this, but it's a grand sacrifice for me. So you should all be super grateful. If I'm starting to feel like that, and I admit that I feel like that sometimes, I pull myself back from that situation because I'm not doing it with any actual good intent. I'm doing it with the idea of getting gratitude and possibly being owed something back. And that's not really healthy for any of us. So you have to look at the health of the entire relationship, and you have to look at your ability to both open gates and close them. If you can't open gates, you shouldn't be shutting them yet.
I love that. That's a great answer. Really helpful and very unique perspective and philosophy on it. So that's excellent. And I think listeners out there, that's nailed it for them. Before we get to the quick fire round, could you just give the top three most important things that people need to do if they start to find themselves burning out, if they're like overwhelmed and overwhelm is leading to this notion of burnout? What is it that you would recommend? What are three things that they should consider doing?
Number one, start some sort of practice of yoga nidra, also known as body scan, also known as non-sleep deep rest. Your brain needs to recover. You can't do that if you're not getting proper rest. So some form of non-sleep deep rest, as Huberman likes to call it, non-sleep deep rest, right? But it's the same as a body scan. It's the same as yoga nidra. It's free on YouTube. It's free on Insight Timer. Find some sort of practice that will help your body come to a restorative place so that your brain can regrow, so that plasticity can be used. So that's number one.
And that would include self-hypnosis as well in that.
Yeah, self-hypnosis, exactly. Any of these techniques that allow your body to enter, even if you're going to hum so that your vagus nerve is toned, like at anything, even the smallest things that you can do, anything you can do to tell your body you're safe, it's okay, you can restore yourself. I like this to be done best just before bed because it increases people's amount of deep sleep. And if we can increase your deep sleep, then we give you more time in your restorative phases, which is long-term more beneficial. But if you're going to do it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and you're going to do it every day, all the power to you. So that's number one. Number two is working on boundaries. Most of the time, this is not necessarily about stopping yourself or extricating yourself from loved ones, but it is about relearning and noticing where your patterns of maybe anxious attachment and codependency are, which are really common in burnout. There's this massive people-pleasing tendency and this massive need to like, oh my God, if I don't do all these things for you, I won't be loved. So realizing how much you actually have to give, how many resources you have, and how you can put those back out into the world. We're not meant to store resources. We're meant to fill up and pour out and fill up and pour out. But if you've been pouring out too much for too long, you have to relearn how to balance that. So that's where boundaries come into play. And the third thing is get aligned with your values. Most of the time, people that are burnt out are living according to someone else's definition of success, someone else's ideas of what is good. Sometimes it's cultural, overarching cultural values. Sometimes it's family stuff that they just never examined, and most of us don't. It's just not something that people commonly do, right? But getting in touch with what will make a good life for you, what's important to you. And those three factors will go a long way in getting you back out of burnout.
Wonderful. Love it. Let's get to the quick fire round. Cait, favorite movie?
God, I hate this game. I told you that. I'm always like, good, because I don't remember movies after I watch them, and I feel guilty having favorites. I can't even answer you.
Favorite movie? I'll try it again. Just give it any
favorite movie. Now I'm just making stuff. I did love My Girl a long, long time ago when I was a kid. Do you remember that?
I think it was better when you weren't answering the question. Favorite author? Favorite author?
Favorite author? I do love Brene Brown.
Favorite book?
Favorite book of all time? The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, yes.
By Bessel van der Kolk.
Very good. Excellent book.
Yep.
Favorite artist?
Lizzo.
Well, I was going to say
artist,
favorite
right?
musician was next. Favorite painter? Or
yeah, Lizzo wins on all that. Favorite painter?
Yeah.
Or photographer?
Yeah.
I do love Georgia O'Keeffe.
Georgia O'Keeffe, for sure. I'm going to pretend I know who that is, but I'm completely photographically illiterate, as anyone who knows me will know. Favorite philosopher?
Favorite philosopher? Are we talking old school? New school?
Talking to anyone.
Anyone? If I had to really think about that, I think Gabor Mate he's not known as a philosopher, but I do like the thought patterns that he puts out into the world.
I get it. Yeah, he definitely qualifies. Favorite TV series?
Favorite TV series? Ted Lasso right now. Because it just
Have you seen
finished.
the ending?
No, not yet.
Okay. If you could have any superpower, what superpower would you have?
Flight.
Flight. If you could
I'd be able to
travel
fly.
back in time or future in time, when would you go?
I would go back in time to talk to my grandmother.
Very cool. If you could live anywhere other than where you live, where would you live?
I have lived so many places. I would go Mendoza, Argentina for at least a couple of years.
Good. Another career, if you could have any other career, if you weren't doing what you're doing.
Stand-up comedy,
And last but not
clearly.
least, if you have one piece of advice for the world on a billboard, what would that piece of advice be?
Burnout is not your fault. Give yourself some grace.
Phenomenal. How do people learn more about you, Cait?
The best and easiest way is to head to Fried the Burnout podcast. It's available everywhere, and from there you'll find all my contact info and everything you need to know.
I'm also going to put all your contact info in the show notes, so make sure you check out the show notes. And what, Cait, pleasure. Really loved our conversation. Thank you so much for doing this, and looking forward to seeing you very soon.
Thanks for having me.